Oh hey, it's Wes. And today I want to talk about the question that, honestly, I get asked more than any other question. Should I get an A9 or an A7 III? Now, I might hear you asking, but the A9 II is out now. Why would I get the A9 Mark I if I get a Mark II? Well, now more than ever, the A9 is closer to the price and more in the competitive field with the A7 III. Now that its price has dropped down all the way to $3,500. It used to be a lot more than that, and people still asked that question back then. So, I've got both these cameras filming on the A9 right now, got the A7 III in my hand. I've used these extensively in many circumstances, mostly weddings, pretty intensive stuff. We're going to dig into the nitty-gritty from my experiences and from the specs that you might not have noticed, and figure out which one of these is right for you. It's not always the most expensive camera that's the best. And on that bombshell, let's get into it. So first of all, the A7 III right now is on sale for $1,800. I don't know if that's going to stay. It might go back to $2,000 afterwards, might drop back down if, say, perhaps an A7 Mark IV comes out. I don't know anything about that though. Let's look at the build quality. Looking up close at these two cameras, they look very similar, but those similarities are mostly skin deep. The two cameras are actually very different deep down. On the face of the A7 III, you have a magnesium body, but that's only in the front part of the camera. If we turn around to the back of the camera, it's actually made of plastic or polycarbonate. One of the reasons why this camera weighs less than the A9. Although the weight difference isn't huge, you can really feel it in the hand. Some might say it makes the A7 III feel like a toy. I would say it's less fatiguing to hold it. Additionally, if you work in cold weather, the plastic around the grip actually makes it easier to use this camera without freezing your mitts, even if your mitts are in mitts. The body design, how you hold it and the handling, is more or less identical. The buttons, however, are a tiny bit mushier on the A7 III. I'm not sure why that is, since they appear to be identical. And then, once we look under the hood, again, skin-deep appearances, they both have a 24 megapixel sensor. They are very different 24 megapixel sensors. The A7 III is actually going to give you slightly better high ISO performance and a slightly sharper image than the A9. Just a little bit on both those fronts. Why is that? Well, the A9 has a slightly stronger anti-aliasing filter because it's designed more for shoot and burn. You're a sports photographer, you gotta shoot out some JPEGs and send them to print. And so you can't necessarily deal with aliasing in your pictures, whereas the A7 III makes a bit of a sacrifice. Sometimes in tight patterns and suits and jackets, you will actually see aliasing artifacts, and you'll have to edit those back out again. But overall, it will give you sharper images. Why is the ISO better in the A7 III? Well, the A9, as we'll talk about a lot, has a stacked sensor. That actually means that there's processing and RAM built into the back of the sensor. It can read the sensor faster, do things that the A7 III can't. But there's a downside of that. That's going to create heat, which is going to reduce both the dynamic range and the noise floor of this camera. And so the sensor doesn't perform quite as well because it runs hotter. But that's fine, that's a trade-off. That's number one, where the A7 III, the cheaper camera, actually beats out the A9. On the sensor itself, they both have 5-stop image stabilization. If we turn around to the side of the camera, we're going to see some more differences here. On the side of the A7 III, we don't have the Ethernet port. Now on the A9, it's only a 100 megabit port, and honestly, unless you're just transferring JPEGs, not fast enough to matter that much. And we don't have the flash sync port. Most people don't care that much about that. I've never used it. So those are things that the A7 III is lacking. But what it lacks, it gains in USB-C port, and this is much faster than the USB micro B port on the A9. How much faster? Well, if you're tethering, the A7 III can transfer a RAW file, compressed RAW, 24 megapixels to the computer in less than a second through that USB-C port, if you have a good cable that gets you the max speed. If you plug in with the USB-B micro on the A9 and tether a RAW file, it can take 7 or 8 seconds to push that file through that slower connection. And again, the Ethernet port on the A9, not very fast, takes over 10 seconds to get a RAW file to the other end. So that's another big win for the A7 III. and actually one of the reasons why I generally shoot with the a7 III when I'm shooting in studio instead of the a9. There's one more big reason for that, and we'll get to that eventually. Coming around to the inside of the body in the viewfinder. The a7 III only has a viewfinder resolution of 1024 by 768. That's some old school specs there. Whereas the a9 has a 1280 by 960 resolution. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but you can definitely tell. Casually looking at the a9, you can't see the pixels, you don't see any what they call screen door effect. You can't tell where one pixel ends and begins. If you look super close and you have very sharp eyes, you will be able to tell. On the new a7R4, they have a resolution of 1600 by 1200. That is super sharp, and it is very hard to tell that you are looking at a viewfinder, an electronic viewfinder at all. And, just to be clear, the a9 Mark II still has the same 1280 by 960 viewfinder. And if we flip around to the back screen of the a7 III is only 640 by 480. That is some old school graphics there. And the a9 is 800 by 600. Sharper, but not that sharp. And to be perfectly honest, neither of these screens is ideal for being used outside. They are not super bright. You'll want to use your viewfinder. It would be nice if you could use the screen more easily outside because, you know, it's articulating. It lets you do some things that you can't otherwise do. But, womp womp, it does not give you a fantastic representation of your exposure when you're working in bright sunlight. Back inside the cameras, let's get more into this stacked sensor that's in the a9 that, honestly, you've probably heard of and really sets these two cameras apart. That will give you the ability to shoot 20 frames per second in full silent, no blackout on the a9, whereas you can max out at 10 frames per second with the mechanical shutter in the a7 III and with the silent shutter. And even when you're using the silent shutter, you still get a blackout. It cannot read the data off that sensor fast enough to match what the a9 does. Additionally, using that silent shutter, you can get your shutter speed up to 1/32,000th of a second. That's fantastic. If you're using wide prime lenses up to 1.8, 1.4, that allows you to shoot in some bright conditions that, honestly, you can't produce the same results when you top out at 1/8000th of a second, as is common for most full-frame cameras. But the shutters. The shutter in the a9, the mechanical one, is not fantastic. If we look at this side by side, it is slow, whereas the one in the a7 III is much faster. Now, we're not just talking about the max 5 frames per second mechanical on the a9, which is not that fantastic for this day and age, versus the 10 of the a7 III. Oh no, we're talking about blackout times. When that shutter comes down on the a9, it comes down for a while by comparison, about twice as long. So if you're using flash, you've got to use the mechanical shutter. Either way, you're going to be using that mechanical shutter. And if you're using high-speed sync flash, you have to turn off your electronic first curtain shutter, and that increases the delay even more. In that case, the a9 starts to feel real slow. And for a fast camera, that's a bit jarring. Whereas when you turn off the electronic first curtain shutter on the a7 III, it's still more manageable. And one more big difference between the shutter operations in these two cameras that I don't know if I've ever heard anyone else talk about. When you're using higher shutter speeds, an electronic first curtain shutter can wreck your bokeh. Now, this is kind of a photographer thing to really nitpick that, but you can notice the difference. However, when you do that on the a9, electronic first curtain shutter at high shutter speeds, it doesn't really affect your bokeh. It seems to fundamentally process this so much faster, so much better, because of its inherently built-in faster electronic shutter. It doesn't do that. So all those times that people have told you, turn off electronic first curtain shutter all the time, it'll always ruin your pictures. That doesn't happen with the a9. It's not even affected. And honestly, I had forgotten that that was a thing until I bought the a7 III. I had the a9 first, and had a bunch of funky looking backgrounded pictures and realized, oh right, the electronic first curtain shutter thing. I had totally forgotten. So it's not even an issue on the a9, but it will get you on the a7 III. Using mechanical shutter, high shutter speeds, even if you're not using flash, you've got to turn off that electronic first curtain shutter if you want your super smooth bokeh. To each their own though, maybe you don't care about that. In those silent shutter modes, which they both have, the a9 can shoot sports, fast action, fast panning. You won't get weird ripple effects and rolling shutter effects in your images. On the a7 III, even if your subject isn't moving fast, but you bring your camera around to take that picture, sometimes you'll get warping. If you're shooting sports or wildlife, things that are moving quickly, you'll get weird jello legs and jello wings if you're shooting in the silent mode on the a7 III. Just shooting everyday people and things in silent on the a7 III, there's really not much of an issue though. It doesn't seem to degrade the image as long as things aren't moving around too fast. However, we're just talking about natural light here. On the a7 III, you're much more likely to get artificial lighting banding in your images. If there's any sort of a pulse width modulation or flicker to the lighting source, the a7 III is going to get things a little funny. You're going to get light and dark bands down your image. This can happen on the a9, however it's highly unlikely. You need something with a very strong flicker. Very commonly happens on the a7 III though. Pretty much any fluorescent bulb, most LED lighting will produce that artifacting to some degree on the a7 III. So the silent shutter on this is tricky. If you're doing professional work, you really have to take some test shots, look at them real close in the viewfinder to make sure you're not ruining these pictures before you take pictures that you're going to be delivering to clients. Whereas in the a9, I would still recommend doing that, but you're much less likely to get tripped up by that. Battery life. Now here's one that you wouldn't expect. On the a7 III, with the lower resolution viewfinder, lower resolution screen, and not a stacked sensor, you actually get 25% better battery life, approximately. Do you notice this? Absolutely. When you're shooting these two cameras side by side, it is very clear that the a9's battery is going down faster than the a7 III's. You win some, you lose some. This one wins that one. And no check marks. Nobody's gonna win because everybody has different applications personally. Image buffer. This thing has a very small image buffer. Now I don't want to kick it right in the pants for the image buffer though. It has approximately the same number of shots in the buffer as the D750, and that is what this camera is competing directly against. This camera is marketed toward wedding photographers, much like the D750. So 33 raw shots in the buffer. The A9, however, can fit 241 raw images in its buffer. That is way more, but the A9 needs it. If you're shooting 20 frames per second, you'll run out of buffer in just over 10 seconds. That is a lot of time though when you take into account that this guy, with the smaller buffer at 10 frames per second, will run out in just over 3 seconds. So yes, the A9 is much more ideal for fast action shooting, rapid shooting. Now here's where it really comes down, moving on to the autofocus. This is a matter of great debate, especially when the a7 III first came out, and its autofocus system on paper seemed very similar to the one in the A9, but it's not. Initially, when it first came out, they were pretty close though. The a7 III evaluates focus 20 times a second, the A9 60 times a second. And honestly, that accounted for most of the difference between the two focus systems when they first launched. Well, when the A9 first launched, it had less contrast detect focus areas, but it didn't seem to affect much. However, since then, the A9 has had some massive firmware updates that has brought real-time tracking in version 5 and 6. So what does that give us? It gives us phenomenally reliable autofocus. So I used to say that the a7 III had 90-ish% of the autofocus of the A9. Now using them side by side, I can't actually say that's any higher than 80%, maybe 75. The a7 III, super reliable, very solid autofocus, but it's not smart autofocus, which isn't really something that anyone expected or looked for back in the day, until recently. But the A9, it feels like it's thinking about everything while you're taking pictures. You can rely on it for many things. I don't want to say it's a crutch, but it helps you do your job better, quicker, and easier. It's better at when someone turns around. It keeps tracking them, moving from eye to face to eye detect autofocus. The a7 III, it just focuses in a very simple way, reliably and effectively, nothing interesting going on there. The A9, it's doing some crazy stuff. Unfortunately, although some people have said they're expecting it, this is not going to get a firmware update to get real-time tracking. Its processor just isn't fast enough to handle that. And there's the business decision. Sony has to save something for the a7 Mark IV, let's face it. So autofocus, this is good. The The A9, it's way better. It's in a different league now. It was just better before, now it's way better. One more interesting point about the autofocus is that the A9 will more or less reliably autofocus down to f16, whereas the a7 III tops out around f11. This isn't a hard stop. Your autofocus will progressively get a little bit worse as you approach that narrow aperture. So if you like to shoot landscapes, or you like to get sun stars, or you want to take a wide shot where everything's in focus, or even real estate if you're the type that likes to use autofocus, the A9 is much more reliable when you're in that sort of situation. The a7 III, once you get up around f7, f8, autofocus starts to get a little bit iffy. And if you're going to be using teleconverters to a large extent, this guy's probably going to let you down. You don't want to be taking bird photography with the a7 III at f11 to f13 when you've got, say, an f5.6 zoom and then a 2x teleconverter on it. This is going to give you a real hard time. Whereas the A9 is designed to shoot through those sorts of challenges. Which camera is right for you? Well, for out and about, natural light, situations where I'm not using flash, the A9 is the winner by far. But if I'm in the studio with the faster mechanical shutter, the faster transfer speeds through the USB-C port, and controlled lighting, where I'm not necessarily shooting at very narrow apertures, honestly, the a7 III is actually the winner for me. They're different tools for different jobs. So, which camera do you have? Which one do you want? Which one do you think is best for you? Let me know down in the comments. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I've used these cameras a lot, and they have lots of different quirks and features unique to each of them. I hope I've answered all your questions. There are 1,000 other things that I could have said about these cameras, but that I didn't think were super significant. So if I left out something that was important to you, I'm sorry. There's just a lot going on. But until next time, let's go take some photos.